At 11:23 a.m., one American pilot spotted 5 Japanese fighters below him. He had 0 kills on his record. 4 minutes later, the sky over Korea was on fire, and he had just made history. At 11:23 on the morning of August 13, 1945, First Lieutenant Oscar Perdomo rolled his P-47N Thunderbolt into a hard left bank over Kijo, Korea. From his altitude, he could clearly see 5 Japanese fighters below him, roughly 8,000 feet down, beginning to split apart and lose their tight formation. Perdomo was only 26 years old. He had flown 9 combat missions and had not scored a single victory in the air. That was about to change. He was the son of a Mexican immigrant, a man whose past included riding with Pancho Villa, and now Oscar was diving into the kind of moment that could define a lifetime. In the next few minutes he would go from a pilot with no kills to a name written into the final pages of World War II air combat. More than 50 Japanese aircraft had climbed to meet 38 American Thunderbolts near what would later become Seoul. The Americans were outnumbered and operating far from their base, around 750 miles away, with hours of open ocean behind them and hours more waiting on the return flight. And while most people believed the war might continue for another year, it was actually only about 48 hours from ending. No one in either formation knew that. The atomic bombs had already fallen on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and at that very moment Emperor Hirohito was meeting with his advisors, weighing surrender. But over Korea, Japanese pilots were still flying, American pilots were still hunting, and Oscar Perdomo was already tipping his nose down toward the enemy. His Thunderbolt carried a name painted on the nose: Lil Mayer's Meat Chopper. The artwork showed a diapered baby chewing a cigar, wearing a derby hat, and gripping a rifle. It was a personal tribute to his infant son, Kenneth, waiting back home in Los Angeles. Perdomo had no way of knowing whether he would ever see his child again. This mission demanded endurance, nearly 8 hours in the air and about 1,500 miles round trip, much of it over open ocean where a single engine failure could mean dying alone in the water. The P-47N was built for exactly that kind of brutal distance. Republic Aviation had redesigned the Thunderbolt for the Pacific, fitting it with wet wings that carried roughly 93 gallons of fuel in each wing. With external tanks, the aircraft could carry well over 200 gallons, giving it the range to escort B-29 superfortresses deep into enemy territory and return. It also carried overwhelming firepower, 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns, thousands of rounds of ammunition, and a massive Pratt Whitney radial engine producing around 2,800 horsepower. Fully loaded, the heavy fighter could still push beyond 460 miles per hour. If it found you, it could destroy you. But for weeks, the enemy had been hard to find. For 6 straight weeks, the 57th Fighter Group had flown missions from Aishima, a small island near Okinawa. They escorted bombers, attacked airfields, and dropped bombs on targets that often offered little resistance. Many pilots believed the Japanese were saving what aircraft they had left for the invasion everyone expected. Some even joked that the enemy must have run out of planes. On August 13th, those jokes ended. That morning's operation launched 53 Thunderbolts at dawn, but the Pacific demanded its usual toll. 15 aircraft turned back early due to mechanical trouble or navigation issues. The remaining 38 pushed northwest across the East China Sea, crossed the Korean coastline, and closed in on Kijo. Then radar operators reported heavy contacts, far more than anyone expected. Japan's 22nd and 85th Sentai had scrambled almost everything available. Ki-84 Frank fighters were in the air, along with Ki-43 Oscar fighters, and even a pair of Yokosuka K-5Y Willow trainers that somehow ended up in the middle of a real air battle. If you want to see how Lil Mayer's Meat Chopper earned its nickname that morning, hit the like button. It helps WW2 Impact bring these forgotten stories to more people. Subscribe if you're new here, because we upload real World War II history that deserves to be remembered. Perdomo focused on 3 enemy aircraft trailing behind the main formation. It was a classic move: hit the aircraft at the back first, because the leaders often won't realize they're under attack until their wingmen are already falling. He pushed the throttle forward and felt the Thunderbolt surge as the distance collapsed fast. 2,000 yards. 1,500. 1,000. At around 800 yards, he centered the gun sight on the nearest Japanese fighter and squeezed the trigger. The war was nearly over, but Oscar Perdomo didn't know that. What he did know was that this was his chance. And he had only minutes of ammunition to make it count. The first burst struck the trailing P-84 exactly where it mattered. The rounds tore into the engine area and the cockpit, and the fighter immediately shuddered. Black smoke poured out as the aircraft rolled into a spiral, falling toward the Korean countryside far below. Perdomo didn't waste time watching it crash. He was already moving his aim to the next target. After 9 missions without a single victory, everything changed in seconds. The enemy was finally here, and Perdomo discovered he had the instincts for this kind of fight. The Ki-84 Frank was one of Japan's best late-war fighters, faster than the Zero, better armed, and capable of challenging American aircraft in ways most Japanese planes no longer could. Allied intelligence considered it one of the few designs still dangerous on equal terms. The pilots flying them that morning were experienced, and some of the best Japan had left. But experience didn't matter when 8.50 caliber machine guns landed clean hits. Perdomo's second target tried to break away to the right, but it wasn't fast enough. The Thunderbolt couldn't turn like a lighter Japanese fighter, and it couldn't climb like one either, but it had a devastating advantage: it could dive like nothing else in the sky. When a P-47 attacked from above and behind, the fight often became simple math: speed, surprise, and heavy firepower. The second Ki-84 took hits across its fuselage. Perdomo saw pieces break off in midair. Then flames erupted, and the fighter became a burning wreck tumbling toward the earth. 2 kills in under a minute. The third Japanese pilot had seen enough. He rolled inverted and dove hard for the deck, trying to escape. Perdomo could have chased him down, but chasing one fleeing aircraft meant losing sight of the wider battle. Somewhere above Korea, dozens of fighters were twisting through the sky, and Perdomo needed to find his squadron again. He pulled into a climbing turn, scanning for the distinctive shapes of friendly Thunderbolts. The sunlight made identification difficult. Aircraft were diving and climbing in every direction, and smoke trails cut across the air like chalk marks. Perdomo noticed parachutes drifting below, but from his position he couldn't tell whether they carried American pilots or Japanese ones. He checked his fuel situation without taking his eyes off the sky. The mission required an 8-hour flight, and every minute of combat burned fuel far faster than cruising. The external tanks had already been dropped. Now he was running on internal fuel only, and the return trip to Aishima would take nearly 4 hours. The numbers were unforgiving. He couldn't afford to waste time. Then he spotted movement low, around 800 feet. 2 aircraft were flying together, heading northeast, and for a moment Perdomo couldn't believe what he was seeing. The silhouettes weren't modern fighters. They were trainers. Yokosuka K-5Y Willows, slow, canvas-covered biplanes that looked like they belonged to another era. Their presence in the middle of a major air battle made no tactical sense, but the markings on their wings made one thing clear. They were Japanese. Perdomo rolled his Thunderbolt inverted and dove, building speed rapidly. The biplanes saw him coming and split apart, each pilot choosing a different escape path. Perdomo selected the closer aircraft and opened fire. The Willow's top speed was barely over 130 miles per hour. The P-47N was diving at more than 400. The engagement lasted only a few seconds. The biplane caught fire, spiraled down, and slammed into the ground, throwing up a dark column of smoke. That was Perdomo's third kill of the morning. He searched for the second Willow but couldn't find it. It either vanished into clouds or disappeared against the terrain below. Perdomo pulled up again and checked his ammunition counters. The numbers had dropped sharply. 3 kills had already consumed a huge portion of his rounds. The meat chopper still had bite, but the time window was shrinking fast. He climbed back toward the clouds, looking for friendly aircraft. But instead of finding his squadron, he was about to fly straight into something far worse. Perdomo climbed through the haze, still searching for friendly Thunderbolts, still trying to rebuild his awareness of the fight. The air above Kijo had become a moving storm, fighters crossing paths at different altitudes, smoke drifting through sunlight, the battlefield constantly reshaping itself second by second. He kept scanning for the broad wings and bulky profile of American P-47s. Instead, what he found was danger. 4 Japanese fighters were already in position, waiting like hunters above the clouds. 4 Ki-84 Franks held the advantage in altitude, and were perfectly lined up to strike. They had watched the American Thunderbolt climb, they had the sun behind them, and they were coming down with speed that could crush a slower pilot before he even understood what was happening. It was the kind of attack that had killed hundreds of Allied pilots earlier in the war, an ambush from above, timed to perfection. Perdomo saw them late. Too late for comfort. Four dark shapes dropped out of the glare, growing larger with terrifying speed. For a split second, his mind did the same calculation every pilot learns the hard way: 4 aircraft, diving fast, guns ready, and only one Thunderbolt below them. He had perhaps 2 seconds to decide what to do, 2 seconds that could determine whether his son Kenneth ever saw his father again. Instinct screamed at him to dive away. But running from a high-speed dive attack often meant taking rounds in the worst possible places: engine, cockpit, fuel system. The P-47 was tough, but no fighter could absorb concentrated fire from 4 opponents at once. Perdomo understood that. He also understood something else: if he reacted the way they expected, he would be predictable. So he did the opposite. He turned into them. It was the kind of decision that feels wrong even while you're doing it, like stepping toward a speeding car instead of jumping away. The Thunderbolt's nose came up, climbing toward the attackers, bleeding speed, doing something no sensible pilot would choose when 4 fighters were diving in to kill him. And for one critical moment, it worked. The Japanese pilots had expected him to drop away, to brake hard, to become a target fleeing downhill. Instead, they saw an American fighter rising into their path. Their aim had to change. Their timing had to change. Their perfect setup suddenly wasn't perfect anymore. That hesitation, just a fraction of a second, was all Perdomo needed. He rolled his P-47 onto its back and pulled hard, forcing the heavy fighter into a violent reversal. The maneuver snapped his aircraft through a change of direction as the Japanese fighters overshot, their dive speed carrying them past and below him exactly as he had hoped. In a blink, the geometry flipped. The attackers were no longer above him. Now they were in front of him. Now they were vulnerable. Perdomo picked the last aircraft in the enemy group, the one trailing the others, and squeezed the trigger. 8.50 caliber guns came alive again, hammering the sky with tracers that reached out like burning lines. The Ki-84 pilot never had a chance to react. The rounds tore into the engine area, ripped through the front of the aircraft, and the fighter erupted into a bright orange fireball that seemed to bloom in midair. Kill number 4. In less than 5 minutes of fighting, Oscar Perdomo had done what most pilots spent entire tours trying to achieve. He had become an ace. Not after months of combat, not after dozens of victories built over time, he had reached ace status in one violent stretch of sky. The remaining 3 Ki-84s scattered immediately. One dropped toward the ground to escape. Another climbed, trying to regain altitude, and reset. The third began a wide turn, as if considering another pass. But Perdomo didn't chase any of them. He couldn't afford to. His ammunition was draining fast, and the fight around him was still chaotic. The longer he stayed tangled up alone, the higher the chance that fuel, luck, or a single unseen enemy would end everything. His counters showed it clearly. He was running low. Not getting low. Low enough to matter. He needed to find friendly aircraft, and start thinking about the long flight home. He leveled out and scanned again. The sky over Kijo was a mess of motion and smoke. Columns rose from crash sites below. Aircraft wheeled at different heights, some still fighting, others breaking away, some simply trying to survive long enough to point their noses toward safety. Then he saw them. 2 P-47Ns at about 3,000 feet, their large propellers catching flashes of sunlight as they maneuvered. Friendly Thunderbolts. For a moment, relief hit him. But the relief didn't last. Because Perdomo immediately noticed what they were dealing with. A single Ki-84 Frank was locked onto the tail of one Thunderbolt, and refused to let go. The American pilot was throwing his aircraft around, hard turns, sudden jinks, desperate moves, trying to shake the Japanese fighter. But the Ki-84 stayed glued behind him, matching every maneuver like a shadow with teeth. The second P-47 was trying to help, but the angles were terrible. Every time the wingman tried to line up a shot, the friendly aircraft kept sliding into the firing line. It was the nightmare scenario, wanting to save your teammate but being unable to fire without risking killing him yourself. Perdomo didn't hesitate. He pushed the throttle forward and dove straight toward the engagement. His Thunderbolt accelerated, heavy and fast, closing the distance quickly. He knew exactly how little ammunition he had left. Maybe 20 seconds of firing time. Maybe less. Whatever was left had to count. He came in the way that had worked every time so far, high, behind, and fast. The Ki-84 pilot was completely focused on finishing the American Thunderbolt in front of him. He was watching his target fill the gun sight, waiting for the right moment to fire. He never checked behind him. He never looked back. He never saw Perdomo dropping in like a hammer at nearly 400 miles per hour. Perdomo pressed the trigger and held it down. Tracers stitched across the air and converged on the P-84. Sparks flickered along the fuselage as rounds struck metal. The Japanese fighter shuddered. Smoke began pouring from its engine. And then, instantly, the gun stopped. Not a slow fade. Not a few last shots. Total silence. All 8 machine guns had run dry at the same moment. Nearly 3,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, enough firepower to rip apart vehicles, buildings, and aircraft, had been burned through in just minutes of combat. The P-84 was damaged, smoking badly, but it was still flying. And now the situation turned dangerous in a different way. The Japanese pilot realized he had been attacked from behind. He broke off his pursuit of the American Thunderbolt and turned toward Perdomo instead. The enemy fighter was wounded, but it still had guns. It still had the ability to kill. Perdomo, on the other hand, had nothing left to shoot. He was alone, deep in hostile airspace, hundreds of miles from home, facing an armed enemy with empty weapons. Most pilots would have done the only logical thing. They would have run. They would have dived away, used the Thunderbolt's speed, and tried to escape before the enemy could line up a shot. The math supported that decision. An unarmed fighter against an armed opponent is not a fair fight, even if the opponent is damaged. But Oscar Perdomo didn't run. The P-84 completed its turn, nose pointed directly at him. The Japanese pilot could see the American markings and the distinctive checkered cowling of the 57th Fighter Group. From his perspective, this was just another American aircraft that needed to be destroyed. He didn't know the truth. He didn't know Perdomo's guns were empty. Perdomo watched the smoking fighter stabilize and begin its attack. The Japanese pilot had weapons. Perdomo didn't. Everything that happened next would depend on nerve, skill, and the ability to convince the enemy of something that wasn't true. Perdomo turned toward him. It made no sense on paper. It broke every rule of survival. But Perdomo understood something the numbers didn't capture. The Japanese pilot couldn't see his ammo counters. He couldn't know the Thunderbolt was harmless. All he could see was an American fighter charging straight at him, head-on, closing at a combined speed that felt like it could tear the sky open. It was aerial chicken, the deadliest kind. The P-84 pilot flinched first. With smoke pouring from his engine and an American fighter apparently committed to the attack, he broke away to the right, abandoning his run. Perdomo stayed with him, turning inside, keeping the pressure on, holding the illusion that he was still dangerous. He kept pointing his nose at the enemy again and again, forcing defensive reactions, buying time, buying space, and hoping friendly aircraft were close enough to help. Then he keyed his radio. He needed assistance. And somewhere in that chaotic sky, another Thunderbolt pilot heard the call. Perdomo's voice cut through the radio traffic with urgency. He didn't waste time with extra words. He needed help, and he needed it immediately. His Thunderbolt was still fast, still powerful, still capable of outmaneuvering a damaged enemy in a dive. But without ammunition, speed alone couldn't finish the fight. He could scare the P-84. He could pressure it. He could force it to defend. But he couldn't destroy it. And if the Japanese pilot realized that even once, the situation would flip instantly. The P-84's engine continued to smoke heavily, leaving a gray trail that marked its path like a warning line across the sky. That smoke was both a weakness and a danger. It meant the aircraft had been hit hard. But it also meant the pilot might become desperate, and desperate pilots sometimes do unpredictable things. Perdomo stayed close enough to keep the pressure on but far enough to avoid flying straight into the enemy's guns. Every movement was calculated. He kept turning toward the P-84, forcing the Japanese pilot to keep breaking away, keep losing energy, keep losing options. Then, at the edge of his vision, he saw another Thunderbolt drop in. The friendly P-47 approached with speed and purpose, lining up behind the smoking P-84. Perdomo didn't know exactly who it was at first. There wasn't time to check names or formations. All that mattered was that someone else still had ammunition. Perdomo made space, shifting his position so the friendly pilot could fire without risk of hitting him. The P-84 tried to pull away, but it was already damaged, already bleeding power, already struggling to keep control. It couldn't accelerate the way it needed to. It couldn't climb the way it wanted to. The American Thunderbolt opened fire. The burst struck cleanly, and the P-84's fate was sealed. Flames flared from the engine area, and the fighter rolled violently. It dropped, spiraling downward, trailing fire and smoke until it disappeared below the cloud layer. Perdomo had just survived a fight he couldn't technically win, because he had turned an empty gun Thunderbolt into a weapon using nothing but intimidation and positioning. Now the air around him felt suddenly quieter. Not calm, never calm in a combat zone, but quieter in the way it feels when the immediate threat is gone, and your brain finally has room to process what just happened. Perdomo had entered the fight with no victories to his name. He now had 4 confirmed kills, and the 5th enemy aircraft had been finished because he forced the situation into a trap. But war doesn't pause to celebrate. He still had to get home. And home was very far away. Perdomo checked his fuel again, and the numbers were uncomfortable. He had spent valuable time in combat, burning fuel at high power settings, climbing, diving, accelerating, everything that drains a tank faster than steady cruising. The mission had been designed around a long flight with controlled consumption. Combat destroyed that plan. The Thunderbolt was built for range, but range only mattered if you managed it correctly. He turned south, trying to reconnect with any remaining friendly aircraft heading back toward Aishima. Above him, scattered Thunderbolts were already forming up and leaving the area. Below, the battlefield was fading behind clouds and distance. Some American pilots were still engaging targets. Others were limping away with damage. A few were missing entirely. Perdomo didn't know the full results yet, but he knew the battle had been real, and costly. As he settled into the long return flight, the adrenaline began to fade. That's when the physical reality hit him. Hours in the cockpit. Sweat inside the flight suit. The constant vibration of the engine. The smell of oil and exhaust. The weight of what he had just done. 4 kills in minutes. A 5th enemy aircraft forced into destruction. And now nothing but ocean and time between him and safety. The sky over the East China Sea looked endless. The water below was flat and merciless, the kind of place where a forced landing didn't feel like an emergency, it felt like a death sentence. Pilots knew the statistics. If your engine quit far from rescue routes, your odds dropped fast. Exposure, dehydration, injuries, and time could finish what the enemy started. Perdomo listened to the engine as if it were alive. Every change in tone mattered. Every small vibration felt suspicious. He had flown long enough to know that you could lose everything to a mechanical failure without warning. And now he had an extra reason to worry. He had pushed the aircraft hard, used full power repeatedly, and stressed the engine during combat. He didn't have the luxury of a backup plan. As the minutes stretched, his mind replayed the fight in flashes. The first dive. The smoke. The sudden explosion when the ambush collapsed. The moment he realized his guns were empty. The head-on bluff that saved his life. The way the Ki-84 pilot broke away, choosing survival over the attack. Perdomo understood that if the Japanese pilot had stayed committed, even for a second longer, the story might have ended differently. But it didn't. And that difference was everything. Somewhere behind him, the war was collapsing. Japan's ability to fight was almost gone. Cities had burned. The Navy had been shattered. Airfields were empty or ruined. Fuel shortages had grounded many aircraft. The pilots still flying were often doing it with outdated equipment, damaged machines, or almost no hope of changing the outcome. Yet even in those final hours, men were still climbing into cockpits and taking off. Because orders were orders. Because pride was pride. Because surrender hadn't officially arrived yet. Perdomo had no idea that history was about to close the book. All he knew was that he was exhausted, running low on fuel, and still had hours to fly. As he continued south, he began spotting familiar shapes again, Thunderbolts, spaced out, each pilot trying to make it back with enough fuel to land. Some were flying in pairs. Some were alone. The long distance had scattered them, and combat had scattered them even more. When Perdomo finally reached Aishima, the island appeared like a small patch of land in a massive ocean. The runway looked thin and fragile from the air, like a strip of safety drawn with a pencil. He lowered his landing gear, eased back on power, and brought the Thunderbolt down carefully. The wheels hit the runway, and the aircraft rolled out with a heavy rumble. Only after he slowed did he truly breathe again. Ground crews rushed in, and other pilots began landing one after another. The base had expected a long-range mission. It hadn't expected one of the most explosive single engagements of the entire war. When Perdomo climbed out, the story started spreading immediately. Pilots who had been in the air with him heard what happened. Mechanics heard it. Officers heard it. And soon, the numbers were being checked and confirmed. 4 aerial victories. 1 additional enemy aircraft destroyed through his action. A status achieved in a matter of minutes. It wasn't just impressive, it was historic. By the time the final reports were compiled, Perdomo's combat on August 13, 1945, stood as the last time an American fighter pilot became an ace in World War II. Not earlier in the war. Not in the middle. At the end, almost at the final moment. His Thunderbolt, Lil Mayer's meat chopper, had lived up to its name in the most brutal way possible. And yet, the strangest part was that Perdomo had spent weeks flying missions without a single victory. He wasn't a celebrity pilot. He wasn't famous. He wasn't even someone the enemy would have recognized. He was just a young man who finally met the fight at the exact moment the fight had almost ended. And he won. If you're watching this on WW2 Impact, and you enjoy true World War II stories told like a real battle, not a boring textbook, make sure you subscribe. These moments matter, and they deserve to be remembered. But Perdomo's story didn't end the moment his wheels touched the runway. Because in just a short time, the war itself would end, and the world would move on. And Perdomo would carry what happened over Korea for the rest of his life. In the days that followed, the world shifted faster than anyone in the air over Korea could have imagined. News moved through bases, across radios, through briefings, and finally into official confirmation. Japan was preparing to surrender. The fighting that had seemed endless for years was suddenly coming to a close. For pilots like Oscar Perdomo, the timing felt unreal. He had just lived through a few minutes of combat so intense that it could have filled an entire career. Then, almost immediately afterward, the war began shutting down. Orders changed. Missions slowed. The constant pressure that had dominated every day began to disappear. But the meaning of what happened on August 13, 1945, didn't disappear with it. Because even though the war ended soon after, Perdomo's engagement remained one of the most extraordinary bursts of air combat ever recorded by an American fighter pilot. Not because he had been hunting kills for months. Not because he was already famous. But because he had been a normal combat pilot, until the sky suddenly gave him a moment where everything happened at once. It's easy to look at the numbers and forget what they actually represent. For confirmed aerial victories in minutes isn't just a statistic. It means 4 separate enemy aircraft, each with a living pilot inside, were destroyed in rapid succession. It means the decisions were made faster than most people can blink. It means one mistake could have ended the entire story instantly. And it means Perdomo did all of it while flying one of the heaviest single-engine fighters of the war. The P-47 Thunderbolt wasn't a graceful aircraft. It didn't float through turns like a lightweight Japanese fighter. It didn't feel delicate. It felt like a machine built to survive violence. Its strength was in speed, firepower, and toughness. It could absorb punishment that would tear other aircraft apart. It could dive like a stone and still remain controllable. It could hit hard enough to end a fight before the enemy understood. They were even being attacked. That day, those qualities mattered. But so did the pilot. Perdomo's decisions weren't lucky guesses. They were the kind of choices that come from training, instinct, and the ability to stay aggressive when fear is trying to take control. His first attacks were clean and disciplined, classic high-speed strikes from advantage. His later fight, when he ran out of ammunition, became something else entirely. That part is what makes his story so unforgettable. An armed fighter can win with firepower. An unarmed fighter has only one weapon left, the enemy's belief that it is still armed. Perdomo used that truth perfectly. He didn't panic when his guns went silent. He didn't freeze. He didn't become passive. He turned his aircraft into a threat using pure confidence and constant pressure, forcing the Japanese pilot into defensive decisions over and over until help arrived. That takes a kind of courage most people never experience. And in the bigger picture, it happened at a moment when Japan's air forces were running out of everything: fuel, aircraft, replacements, time. The pilots still flying in August 1945 were often doing it under impossible conditions. Many were exhausted. Many were flying machines that were worn down, repaired repeatedly, or barely operational. Some were being sent into combat with almost no chance of returning. The fact that so many Japanese aircraft were in the air that morning surprised the Americans for a reason. Most U.S. pilots had expected only scattered resistance. Instead, they found a real formation ready to fight. That clash over Korea became one of the final violent sparks of a war that was already dying. And Perdomo happened to be the man who lit up the sky in the middle of it. After the war ended, Perdomo returned home. Like so many veterans, he carried the memory of combat into a world that wanted to move forward. People celebrated victory. Parades happened. Families reunited. Newspapers moved on to the next headline. But the men who fought didn't always move on as easily. Perdomo had survived missions where others didn't. He had flown hours over open water where a single mechanical failure could erase you from the map. He had fought in the air, watched aircraft burn, watched men fall, and returned to land when the outcome could have been death. And then, suddenly it was over. For the rest of his life, his name remained tied to that single day, August 13, 1945, the day he became an ace in one burst of action, and the day he became the last American fighter ace of World War II. Not the last ace in general. Not the last pilot to score victories. But the last time an American pilot achieved ace status in the air during that war. That detail matters, because it places him at the end of an era. World War II air combat was brutal and personal. It wasn't remote. It wasn't guided by computers. It was men in cockpits, eyes scanning the sky, hands gripping controls, deciding everything in seconds. It was courage mixed with fear, training mixed with chaos. And on that day, Perdomo proved he belonged in that world. His Thunderbolt's name, Lil Mayer's Meat Chopper, stayed in memory too. A name painted for his baby son, something warm and human, attached to an aircraft that became a symbol of destruction for a few minutes over Korea. It's a strange contrast, but war is full of those contradictions. A father flying to survive. A young man carrying the weight of an entire mission. A heavy fighter diving into a swarm. And 5 enemy aircraft that didn't make it home. When you watch stories like this, it's easy to think of them like scenes in a movie. But these were real men, real machines, real decisions, and real consequences. The sky didn't care about luck or dreams or plans. It rewarded the pilot who stayed sharp, stayed aggressive, and used every advantage before time ran out. Oscar Perdomo did exactly that. And in the final days of the war, when the world was about to change forever, he left behind one last chapter of aerial combat that still shocks people today. If you made it to the end, you're a legend. Drop a comment below. 1 versus 5. So I know you watched the full story. And if you want more World War II aviation battles, rare ace stories, and forgotten missions told like real combat, make sure you subscribe to WW2 Impact. Because history isn't just dates and names. Sometimes it's one pilot, one Thunderbolt, and a few minutes that never get repeated again.